I spent the first half of my life living on the bay in Panama City, Florida. And I know a lot of y'all listening might associate Panama City with spring break and giant college parties on beaches. But that's not really what I remember about living there, and it isn't what defines the town either, in my opinion. I remember growing up in a beautiful, historic North Florida community. I lived within a mile of my grandparents, cousins, and close family friends. And I spent mornings fishing in the bay, afternoons watching college football and eating oysters with family and friends, and evenings walking through a beautiful neighborhood filled with these giant 200-year-old oak trees. So yeah, it was a pretty good childhood. However, I was also scared of a lot of things, and I was a very wimpy kid. One of the things I was scared of was thunderstorms, and unfortunately for me, we could get some pretty nasty ones. If a storm was coming, my eyes would be glued to the Weather Channel. I quickly found that information comforted me, so with my fear of thunderstorms, I began to learn a lot about the weather. I also became more curious of what if situations and worst case scenarios. What would happen to our family if an EF3 tornado hit our house? What would we do in a Category 5 hurricane? I would always ask my family these kinds of questions, and they would always tell me to stop worrying so much, that such a thing would never happen, and that the odds of it happening were so slim that it was almost impossible. And as I grew up and gained a better understanding of statistics and odds, I began to believe the same. And then this happened. On October 10th, 2018, Hurricane Michael made a direct Category 5 landfall on my childhood hometown of Panama City, Florida, and the neighboring town of Mexico Beach, Florida. My grandparents, cousins, aunt and uncle, and close family friends were all caught in the eye of this devastating storm. While luckily everyone I knew emerged physically unharmed, the damage done was catastrophic. All of the trees were either gone or snapped in half. For most, there was no running water for days, no power for weeks, and no cell service for a month. It was truly the worst case scenario we'd hoped would never happen. I was lucky because I no longer lived in Panama City, and I hadn't for about 10 years. However, I was still connected enough to the town and the people in it to see just how much was lost and how hard it was for those who still lived there. I remembered how everything looked before the storm, and I remember being utterly shocked by how unrecognizable Hurricane Michael had made everything. The pictures you've been seeing that are in black and white were actually taken by me in March of 2019, about 5 months after Hurricane Michael hit. So as you can see, the recovery process for this sort of thing is not fast. In the months and years after this storm, I began to see just what makes these events not only natural, physical disasters, but also human disasters that disproportionately affect those previously disadvantaged. You see, pre-existing and long-term problems don't disappear when a natural disaster hits. That might sound like an obvious statement, but it's something I had never really thought about before Hurricane Michael. I think it's in part because of the way our national news cycle operates. We're shown the general physical destruction caused by a disaster, but we aren't shown what life is really like for people affected in the long run. And we aren't shown how people are impacted differently depending on their background and socioeconomic status. If I had more time today, I would talk about Hurricane Michael's impact on crime, education, mental health, and a host of other social issues. But today, with the time I have, I'm only going to focus on the security and housing of those most disadvantaged. In the wake of a natural disaster, the available supply of resources like food, shelter, and employment dropped dramatically. At the same time, the demand for these same resources increased quite a bit as everyone's trying to regain what they've lost. And when supply is low and demand is high, not everyone's going to get what they need. In fact, some people are going to be left with nothing. I don't think I can think of a single person that we know of whose property was not damaged by the storm. Mark McQueen, the city manager of Panama City, actually reported that over 90% of homes and structures in the county were damaged or destroyed. My grandpa's house had giant trees that had fallen on it and around it. My grandmother-in-law's home was unlivable, as were the homes of many of our family friends. If you lived in Mexico Beach, there was a pretty good chance that the storm surge wiped your home off the map. Local officials estimated that somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people were left homeless by this storm. And when you combine these homeless people with those who need to move out of their homes for repairs, it should be pretty easy to understand why the demand for housing in Panama City would skyrocket. And unfortunately, there was very little housing available, so rent prices also skyrocketed. And if you didn't have the available savings or the insurance to cover the costs, it was almost impossible to find anything affordable. On top of that, FEMA failed to provide sufficient temporary housing to those in need. Out of a list of over 300 options, FEMA only offered one temporary housing option in the Panama City area. Most temporary housing options were miles and hours away. As a result, a lot of people ended up living in tents and campers for months. People who had damaged homes decided to stay in their homes, which is a giant safety risk when you consider what can happen with problems with gas and electricity. A lot of people also lost their jobs, and local news and AP News actually reported that foreclosure rates spiked as people could not only not afford to pay for repairs for their homes, they couldn't afford to even keep their homes. And people who rented homes, most of them were evicted because the people who owned those needed to do repairs. So, as you can see, the allocation of scarce resources is already a problem in most communities, but it is magnified tenfold in the wake of a natural disaster. While some people, while everybody loses their sense of stability, those left without access to important resources lose their sense of security as well. How can you even begin to expect someone to recover or feel secure when they don't have a roof over their heads? What I will say is that it takes much longer to return to a new and comfortable normal. And there has been progress towards this new normal. My cousins just got to move back into their house, and a lot of properties throughout Panama City are fixed and rebuilt. However, a lot of them also aren't, and there will always be reminders of Hurricane Michael. The old normal won't come back, and people will never forget this storm. What I've talked about today isn't something that only happened to people hit by Hurricane Michael, and it's not something that's new either. What I witnessed also happened to victims of Hurricane Katrina, Harvey, Laura, Sandy, Irma. I could continue listing them. And it also doesn't just happen to hurricane victims. Any natural disaster will do this. People in California are still reeling from wildfires. East Nashville is still struggling to rebuild after a tornado hit in the spring. And unfortunately, these sort of events are only going to happen more in the future as climate change continues, as scientists have proven that climate change will lead to more frequent and more severe natural disasters. So what's the point of me telling you all this today? One of the biggest things that my family in Florida would always tell me was how frustrated they felt to be largely forgotten and ignored by the rest of the country. And in Hurricane Michael, this was especially the case. Whereas Hurricane Michael caused twice as much damage in terms of costs compared to Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Michael victims only received about a third of the amount of donations as Hurricane Irma victims. And this happened in part because of other events happening at the same time that monopolized time on the news. And it just seemed like nobody really stopped to think about what had happened or how it affected the people impacted. When you guys walk away from this today and see a natural disaster covered on the news, I don't want you to just think of the physical damage and move on. I want you to think about what I've talked about today. When you see this, I want you to think of the people who have to live in tents or campers for months because they have nowhere else to go. When you see this, I want you to think of the people who have to sift through the ashes of their old home because they are trying to find something salvageable. I want you to think of the communities, the people that are affected by these events. And I truly believe that when we have a better understanding of the issues caused by these disasters, and when we can find genuine sympathy for those affected, that's when we're able to better address these issues in the future, and that's when we're able to help those in need. Thank you.